Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be taking a look at creative writing. Specifically, this video is going to be created for anyone that is studying English language and looking at question 5 for paper 1. Now this can be a really difficult one to go through, so please do check out our other videos that are going to go through this in more depth over the next few weeks. We're going to be breaking down the question and just helping to support you as our exams get closer and closer. Now if you haven't done so already, please can you like and subscribe, it really does help us out when you do so. So the first thing I'd like you to do is have a look at the images and just think about the following questions. So first of all then, which of these images best represents how you feel about creative writing? Now this can often be the most stressful part of the exam, so have a think, is it the medal? Are you just okay? Or is it something that's causing quite a bit of stress? Again, it is worth 40 marks within the exam, so it's a really important question. It's really good to go through this and make sure that we actually feel confident before we go for the exam. Super challenge, what I'd like you to do is think about what kind of skills or methods are needed to write a successful response. And finally, can you recall an acronym that is used for creative writing? So if you're thinking about paper 2, for example, the acronym we use for writing in transactional writing is called DeForest. There's also one that we use for creative writing. So when we say an acronym, it's a group of letters that have been put together to form one word, and that word will represent some of the key language techniques that we need for our creative writing. By the end of the video, you'll be able to recall the key techniques needed for creative writing, understand how to beat the mark scheme, and finally, apply your understanding to an exam style question. So paper 1, question 5, look at the overview of creative writing and make some notes on some of the key details. So when you get your exam paper, you're going to have a section that looks very similar to this. So it will say section B writing. You're advised to spend 45 minutes on this section. Write in full sentences. You're reminded of the need to plan your answer. You should leave enough time at the end to check your work. Now, these are just guidance points. They're not things that you necessarily have to do. And when I say that, obviously you do need to write in full sentences, and it is always good to check your work. But when it says about a plan is a good thing to do if you can plan effectively. So really, when you think about this task, you've got a big 40-mark question. We shouldn't be spending too long actually doing the plan, right? Because you've got an hour and 45 for the whole exam paper. Any time that you spend doing a plan might also relate to the rest of the question or the rest of the actual exam paper, where you're really eating into that time. So you should be thinking about a nice, easy and straightforward way to plan that's actually going to help you to write your response. Here are a few top tips that you can use to help you with your creative writing. So the first thing would be begin your response using sensory language. So if you're not sure what we mean by sensory language, that is of course your 5 senses. So smell, touch, taste, hear and sight. Apply your understanding of language and structure to your own response. So if you think about question 1 to 4 in paper 1, all of those questions are really testing your ability to select and identify those key techniques on language and structure. And question 5 is about, can you apply those same techniques to your own creative writing? Introduce a conflict. So when we say conflict, we mean a problem. You don't get a story without a conflict, so there has to be something to carry the story on from either the scenario that you go with or the image that you've been presented with. Use the Go Massive acronym to recall the key language devices for creative writing. Now this is the acronym that I was referring to earlier. It's a really good thing to use if you struggle to remember some of the key techniques that are going to help you get a decent mark in the exam. Now these aren't inclusive, it doesn't include every single language technique, but they are some of the good ones that I'd expect to see in your response. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at that acronym and we're going to think about it in a bit more detail. So if you want to pause the video here to make a few notes, please feel free to do so, and we're now going to just jump ahead. Look at the acronym below and work out the language techniques that each letter represents. So you probably know many of these language techniques because a lot of them are ones that you would have encountered when you're doing things like question 2 for paper 1 and also question 4. However, if you're not too sure what they might represent, use the clues below to help you work it out. So first of all then, for clue 1, words that sound like the noises they make. So that's referring to one of the language techniques. Clue number 2, this is when we repeat the same letter 2 or more times to add some extra emphasis. And clue number 3, this is where you use like or as to make a comparison. So what I'd like you to do is just spend a minute or two, see if you can recall the techniques yourself. The more you're able to do this, the easier it's going to be in the exam, because you'll know the kind of things that you need to include to get yourself a reasonable mark. Now, a moment ago we spoke about the need to plan. Now, I'm not a big planning person, but what I would do is I would go massive vertically down the side of my page, and every time I've used one of these techniques, I would simply tick it off to show that I'm keeping track of the kind of techniques that are in there. Now, this is just to help me keep track and make sure that I'm using a range of techniques and allow me to get higher up in the grade boundary. You'd also want to avoid using the same technique too many times. So for example, if you've used a simile, which is one of the S's in Go Massive, that is fantastic, but you don't want to keep using a simile over and over again, because for as far as the examiner is concerned, yes, you've shown how to use that one technique, but what else can you do? How can you demonstrate that you know how to use a range of language techniques and not just the same one over and over again? Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. So here we've got our Go Massive techniques then. Here's our acronym, and this is what each of them stands for. So for the G then, we have a group of 3. This is also referred to as a triplet or a rule of 3. The O is onomatopoeia. The M is metaphor. The A is alliteration. We've got S as simile and S as sensory language. We've got imagery, a varied vocabulary, and the final one is emotive language. So as we've said before, this isn't inclusive. It doesn't include every single one of the language techniques. So a good habit to get into is to try and stretch and challenge yourself and think about what other techniques could you include just to make sure you get the highest grade possible. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at a few example responses. So first of all, you'll be given a stimulus, but what we're going to focus on specifically is AO5. Now, AO5 is something that we look at in the mark scheme, which specifically focuses on content and organization, and you can see that just above here. Okay, now the way that the exam works, you get 24 marks for content and organization, and that's what we're going to focus on at the moment, because that's where the vast majority of the marks are. This is going to be referring to the kind of techniques you're using and how you've actually laid out your response. So have you used a range of decent techniques? Have you thought about the kind of vocabulary you're using? And have you wrote in paragraphs? At the moment, that's all we're going to focus on. And then for another video, we're going to think about improving our technical accuracy. Look at the image and attempt the challenges that follow. So this is going to be a very typical stimulus that you might get in an exam. And the first thing I'd like to think about is, can you identify 3 features that catch your eye in the image? So if we just think about that together, the first thing that I would probably think about would be, let's say, the train itself. It does dominate most of the image, and we would have it in colour as well. So you could probably talk about the vivid colours of the actual train. It clearly is quite an old-fashioned one. So I'd maybe think about incorporating some sensory language, like the sounds it might make, or the smell or the smoke or something like that to engage the reader. Another thing that would grab my attention would be the 2 characters that are in the foreground. So the foreground is the one that's closest to us, background is the one where it's furthest away. So these are going to formulate maybe the protagonists or antagonists of our story. I'd try and think about what kind of age they are. I'd have a look at their luggage. For example, the bag that the young man is wearing doesn't seem to be an everyday bag. It seems like the kind of thing they wear when they're going across country or on a big travelling trip or something like that. So I might think about incorporating that potentially. I'd also notice that there's not any other passengers on the platform, and that might help to create a rather sinister feel to my writing. Maybe something is going on, maybe they shouldn't be there. Maybe this is where I can start thinking about incorporating a conflict into my writing. And the last thing I want you to think about then is, what perspective would you use for this piece of writing? So generally speaking, we either go first person or third person. So if you're not sure what we mean by that, first person is when you are the character, and you'll use language such as I did this, I did that. When it's third person, you'll actually have a character with a name. So Tom did this, Holly did that, for example. And that's a slightly different way to write it. Now there's really no right or wrong way to do it. Either you go first person or third. The main thing to make sure is that you don't switch in between, and just make sure you use whichever version that you think works for you. So the only other thing then, I want you to stretch and challenge. Try and have a look at the response on the next slides. Think about which ones would achieve a higher mark and try and justify your answer. We're going to actually look at both of them, and we're going to try and think about what kind of mark they're going to get as well compared to the mark scheme. Look at the response and evaluate the quality of the writing. So here I have our typical question 5 response. It's only a very small portion of the response, so it's just a snapshot. It's not the full extent of it. Obviously in the exam we'll be looking to write more like 5 paragraphs, and you can see here we only have 2. So as we go through, I want you to try and understand or identify anything that works well or anything that might need to be improved. So it says then, the train gave a hiss like a snake as it arrived at the station. There was a lot of noise and smoke all about the platform. Tom and Holly were waiting for the train and feeling really nervous. There was sweat all over Tom's face. The sweat attacked his clothes, making him smell like a tramp. When the train came to a stop, they both got on board, swaying like drunk people after a good night out. As the doors closed behind them, Holly felt a sense of release wash over her like the waves of the sea. So I'd like you to have a look through the response now and just see if there's anything that you think works well or anything that might need to be improved. Is there any kind of language techniques that you've identified or anything like that? And try and think, just for the actual content and organisation, what kind of mark would this achieve? Now if you don't want us to reveal the answers, then you might need to pause the video here. I'm going to show you the mark scheme and also the marks that we've arrived at as well. So first thing is we're going to look at is content. And one of the big problems we have with English teachers is that when we create things like mark schemes, we use a lot of very technical language, so it can be hard to understand specifically where the marks actually come from. So if we look at the one for content then, it says communicate with some sustained success. So basically this comes down to, have you communicated properly? Does it make sense? Some sustained attempt to match tone and style and register to purpose and audience. So does it actually match the image? Does it sound like something suitable that someone would write in relation to the actual stimulus you've been given? Conscious use of vocabulary. So this actually comes down to our Go Massive techniques with the varied vocabulary. So are you using more engaging, interesting words, or are they quite bog standard and boring? And then with some use of linguistic devices. Now, linguistic devices is just the same thing as saying language techniques. The word we want to focus on, however, is this word some. Now, this word is very, very problematic because what this is actually suggesting is that the person has only used, let's say, a few language techniques. And from everything we've kind of learnt within English, we know that's not going to be enough to get them a decent mark. What we actually want them to say is that they've used a range of techniques. Now that's kind of the key word that we want to be focusing on. Some implies that they've used a few, but not really enough to get a high mark. Organisation. So this talks about our structural features, whether we've been writing in paragraphs. Okay, so some use of paragraphs and discourse markers. So basic kind of organisation, and we can see they've used paragraphs there obviously, but are they integrated? Are they linked and relevant to each other? Do they flow nicely like a proper narrative would or a proper story would? Okay, and again we've got similar kind of vocabulary here with a horrible word of some as well, which again implies that they're not doing this consistently. Now this is the marks that I would award this out of 24, sorry. So I'd say it would approximately get 12 marks out of 24, but only if the quality of the writing is sustained, if it's carried on. Okay, this actually isn't too bad as a response. We can see there are a few techniques there, but a lot of the things in there need to be improved or actually developed a bit further. Okay, so there's a lot of elements there that do work well, but there's also some areas that need to be developed. Okay, when we think about it, we have started off quite well with the simile. The train gave a hiss like a snake as it arrived at the station. Okay, it's used a simile, that's all good. There was a lot of noise and smoke all about the platform. So straight away this is problematic. Why haven't they developed the description? Why haven't they taken it further? Why haven't they used better words than noise? How noisy was it? How much smoke was there? This description really needs to be developed a lot further. So now what we're going to do, we're going to look at the next response and see if that would be improved or whether it will get a higher mark when we actually come to do the assessment. If you need any additional support or help, then new videos will be added every single week. Alternatively, leave us a comment below or visit our partner channel, Bookworm Teaching, for more lessons and guidance on all things English. Thanks ever so much for listening, guys, and all the best with your work and revision in the future. Bye bye.